If you wonder where Jesus spent his 20s, popular legends point across oceans to the temples of India or monastic enclaves in Egypt. Yet the definitive forensic evidence has been hiding in plain sight inside an 11-word question preserved in Mark chapter 6. When he returned to teach in his hometown, the crowd did not whisper about an exotic traveler returning after decades away. They looked at his sun-darkened face and asked, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" To casual readers, this verse is merely a record of local skepticism, but to a historical investigator, it is an accidental time capsule. It preserves the exact social, economic, and physical reality of Jesus at age 20, documented not by distant chroniclers, but by the very neighbors who watched him grow. To understand why this single reaction is so revealing, we have to look at the sheer scale of first-century Nazareth. Archaeological excavations reveal that this was not a bustling trade town or a fortified city, but a modest agricultural hamlet clinging to a limestone ridge, home to roughly 200 to 400 people. In a settlement of that size, consisting of perhaps 30 to 50 extended stone households clustered around shared courtyards, anonymity was physically impossible. Everyone knew whose hands had carved the olive wood storage chests, who had mortared the field terraces, and who had walked the rocky footpaths every morning since childhood. This creates an evidentiary benchmark that historians call unintentional testimony. Ancient biographers routinely omitted the ordinary youth of their subjects because routine manual labor was not considered worthy of heroic record. Yet the Gospel of Mark preserves an unvarnished village reaction. If Jesus had vanished during his late teens and 20s to study under philosophers in Alexandria or ascetic gurus along the Indus River, the villagers would have reacted to a mysterious stranger. Their bewilderment would have centered on his exotic absence, his foreign clothes, or where he had acquired such distant learning. Instead, their offense was born entirely of mundane, exhausting familiarity. They recognized the white limestone dust settling into the creases of his rough wool tunic, the familiar calluses on his palms, and the unmistakable cadence of his rural Galilean dialect. They did not see an enlightened wanderer stepping out of the desert. They saw the local craftsman who had spent the last decade fulfilling work orders, negotiating over timber, and eating his daily bread in the same dusty alleys. They were offended precisely because his 20s had been entirely, undeniably ordinary. When modern scholars analyze Mark chapter 6, they discover that this short question functions like a forensic artifact containing 3 distinct, interlocking layers of evidence. Each phrase within that 11-word sentence answers a specific dimension of his missing 20s, the brutal physical trade that shaped his body, the regional economic engine that pulled him out of his village, and the sudden domestic tragedy that forced him to shoulder an entire family's survival at age 20. To reconstruct where Jesus was and what he was enduring during those silent years, we have to strip away centuries of polished European art and step directly into the physical grit of the ancient Levant. The investigation does not begin in a quiet temple court or a monastic library. It begins with the heavy iron tools, the quarry dust, and the true meaning of the trade that defined his youth. The forensic investigation begins with a single ancient word that translations have systematically softened. In the original Greek of Mark chapter 6, the crowd does not merely describe an occupation, they identify him as Tekton. While modern culture pictures a carpenter working comfortably in a small wood shop, fashioning tables or cradles, the landscape of first-century Galilee paints a vastly different reality. In the arid hills of the lower Galilean plateau, large timber was an expensive luxury, tightly controlled by Roman provincial authorities and local estates. Domestic homes, terraced walls, wine presses, and olive oil cisterns were constructed almost entirely from hard native limestone. A Tekton in this environment was an architectural artisan, a heavy stonemason, and a structural builder rolled into one. To be 20 years old and working as a Tekton meant spending 10 to 12 hours a day swinging heavy iron mallets, splitting limestone blocks from local quarries, and hauling 50-pound boulders up steep hill paths. It meant your hands were permanently scarred by sharp stone edges, your skin baked brown by the Mediterranean sun, and your lungs accustomed to the chalky dust rising from every chisel strike. This historical detail strips away any romanticized notion of a contemplative, shielded youth. When the villagers of Nazareth looked at Jesus at age 20, they did not see a cloistered scholar or an untouchable holy man. They saw a laborer whose physical frame bore the direct, exhausting toll of heavy masonry. Yet this discovery immediately introduces a profound economic riddle. A tiny, farming hamlet of 300 people simply could not generate enough construction work to sustain a skilled builder year after year. Once a family stone house was finished and the local terraces were repaired, local demand dried up. To earn a living at age 20, a craftsman in Nazareth had to look beyond his village borders. If you stand on the northern ridge just above ancient Nazareth and look across the valley, the answer emerges on the immediate horizon. Less than 4 miles away, a brisk 50-minute walk across the rolling hills, sat the regional metropolis of Sepphoris. Archaeology reveals that around the exact decade Jesus turned 20, Sepphoris was undergoing the most explosive urban rebuilding program in Galilean history. Following its destruction by the Roman general Varus in 4 BC, the client ruler Herod Antipas transformed the ruined city into his royal capital, an opulent Greco-Roman center he proudly called the ornament of all Galilee. For a young craftsman living in nearby Nazareth, Sepphoris was the undeniable economic center of gravity. Every morning before dawn, hundreds of rural day laborers and skilled artisans walked the worn dirt trail toward the capital's rising gates. There, amid towering Roman colonnades, royal palaces, paved boulevards, and a 4,000-seat amphitheater, builders from across the region found daily employment. Imagine a 20-year-old Jesus standing on the wooden scaffolding of Sepphoris, chisel in hand, looking down at two completely contradictory worlds colliding. Beneath him walked wealthy Hellenized elites, dressed in fine linen, Roman tax officials tallying imports, and Roman soldiers patrolling the market. Beside him worked impoverished Galilean peasants, struggling under crushing imperial taxes and losing their ancestral family plots. His 20s were not spent in isolation from the world's corruption. They were spent working at the very epicenter of imperial exploitation and social injustice. Yet, the question preserved in Mark 6 holds an even more intimate, personal clue hidden within its grammar. The villagers did not identify him as the son of Joseph. They called him the son of Mary. In the strictly patriarchal culture of the ancient Near East, identifying an adult male by his mother's name was an extraordinary break from custom. A Jewish man was universally addressed as the son of his father, even decades after his father had passed away, in order to maintain the family's legal lineage and property rights. To be publicly designated by your mother's name carried a specific social meaning. It signaled that the father was long dead, and that the eldest son had officially become the legal protector and primary provider of the household. Joseph appears vividly in the nativity accounts and makes a final, fleeting appearance when Jesus is 12 years old in the Jerusalem temple. After that moment, Joseph vanishes from the historical record entirely. By the time Jesus was 20, the silence of the texts and the wording of Mark 6 indicate that Joseph was already buried in the rocky soil of Nazareth. The weight of that loss meant that at age 20, Jesus was not merely an itinerant craftsman. He was the head of a vulnerable household. In the very same verse, the villagers name 4 younger brothers, James, Joses, Judas, and Simon, along with at least 2 unnamed sisters. This transforms our understanding of his silent 20s from passive waiting into intense domestic responsibility. Before he ever carried the spiritual burdens of humanity, he carried the immediate economic burden of keeping 7 younger siblings and a widowed mother fed and sheltered. Every contract he negotiated, every load of stones he carried, and every measure of barley he received as barter wages was a matter of basic family survival. At 20 years old, he learned obedience, patience, and grief not in the abstract, but through the relentless duty of an eldest son holding his family together. Honest scholarship requires us to recognize what this single verse can and cannot prove. Mark chapter 6 does not give us a day-by-day diary, nor does it document every conversation Jesus had around a Galilean evening fire. It cannot prove that he never made seasonal pilgrimages south to Jerusalem for the major Jewish feasts, or that he never walked the coastal trade routes along the Mediterranean for temporary work. History rarely grants us exhaustive transcripts of the ancient working class, and the gaps in his daily routine will always leave room for humble mystery. Yet, what the evidence definitively dismantles is the enduring myth of the lost wanderer. The sheer immediacy of the villagers' reaction leaves no room for a man who had vanished for a decade into the monastic cloisters of Egypt or the far reaches of the Silk Road. An entire village does not look at an unfamiliar, returning ascetic and dismiss him instantly as the local builder whose family they know by name. The silence of early historical records is not evidence of a conspiracy or a lost esoteric journey. It is the natural consequence of an ancient world that never bothered to write down the lives of ordinary laborers. There is a quiet irony in how our modern imagination approaches the missing years of Jesus. We instinctively want the silent years to be filled with the extraordinary, mystical initiations, exotic travels, or miraculous encounters in distant lands. We search the far horizons for something grand enough to justify the quiet between the 12-year-old in the temple and the 30-year-old stepping into the Jordan River. Yet the single verse of Mark chapter 6 reveals that the truth is far more profound than any legend. At age 20, the preparation of Jesus did not happen in the quiet abstraction of a palace or a mountain retreat. It happened in the grit of the physical world. It was forged in the weight of limestone blocks, the negotiation of fair wages, the grief of burying his earthly father, and the daily, unglamorous faithfulness required to keep a family fed. When the sun set over lower Galilee, casting long shadows across the 4-mile path from Sepphoris back to Nazareth, a 20-year-old craftsman would brush the white stone dust from his arms and step through the low doorway of his home. The 11 words, spoken by his neighbors decades later, were meant as a dismissive insult. But across 2,000 years, they remain the most grounded testimony in human history. Long before he was hailed as a king, he was known simply, fully, and honorably as the carpenter, the son of Mary.